In a small, sun-scorched village nestled between rolling hills and winding rivers, lived a young girl whose life was far from easy. She carried herself with a quiet dignity that made her presence almost ethereal. Her name was whispered with admiration by those who truly saw her gentle spirit, though many turned a blind eye to her suffering, too envious or self-absorbed to notice. The girl's beauty was subtle, the kind that did not demand attention but drew it nonetheless. Soft, intelligent eyes that reflected the light of dawn, a slender frame that moved with unassuming grace, and hands calloused from years of toil yet soft in expression and intent. She possessed a heart untainted by malice, always ready to help the elderly fetch water, tend to the sick, or guide the younger children safely across the village paths. Her laughter, though seldom heard in recent times, held a rare melody, bright as the morning birds that greeted the sun each day. Her life, however, was shadowed by the cruelty of her stepmother, a woman whose heart had long hardened with greed and envy. The stepmother saw in the girl not a daughter to nurture, but a rival to diminish. Each day she devised subtle torments, demanding the impossible from the girl, withholding food, and assigning menial chores that left her exhausted before nightfall. While the girl's father, though stern, often looked the other way, unable or unwilling to challenge the stepmother, she bore these burdens silently, her spirit resilient but weary. Villagers whispered that the stepmother's animosity stemmed not only from jealousy but from fear that the girl's kindness and quiet strength would one day earn admiration, leaving her own daughterless and powerless. The village itself, a patchwork of mud huts and narrow alleys, bore witness to the girl's suffering, though many considered it none of their business. Eyes followed her as she passed, some curious, others indifferent, and a few secretly wishing her misfortune to balance their own envy. Yet she remained unbending, her spirit quietly radiating warmth even when her stomach ached from insufficient meals or her hands bled from chores. She had learned, through long nights and harsh days, to endure, to bend like the reeds in the river wind but never to break entirely. Her humility was her armor, her gentle nature her secret weapon against the cruelty that surrounded her. The stepmother's greed knew no bounds. She longed for wealth, for influence, and for the satisfaction of seeing the girl diminished, removed entirely from the life she herself controlled. When traders passed through the village bearing salt, an invaluable commodity coveted far and wide, the stepmother's mind began to churn with a scheme that would rid her of the girl forever while profiting her own family. Salt, rare and precious, could be exchanged for wealth, goods, or even favors from influential people in nearby towns. To her stepmother, the girl had become a burden in more ways than one. She was a reminder of her husband's affection for his late first wife, a living symbol of virtue and beauty that threatened the stepmother's dominion. Selling her away seemed not only practical but necessary, a solution that would eliminate a rival and enrich her own standing. The girl, though young, sensed the cold intentions swirling around her. She noticed the whispered conversations in shadowed corners, the way the stepmother's eyes gleamed with secret calculation, and the sharp tension in the air whenever she approached. Yet she could not confront this looming betrayal directly. She lacked both power and protection. Her courage was quiet, not loud or defiant, and she relied on patience, on the hope that reason or goodness might prevail. But the world she lived in was one where greed often outweighed morality, where envy poisoned hearts, and where innocence was too easily exploited. She thought of her mother, long gone, whose gentle hands had once smoothed her hair and taught her the value of kindness in a harsh world. Those memories were her solace, small sparks of warmth in an otherwise bleak existence. The girl understood that she could not change the malice of others, but she could endure, she could survive. And yet, the encroaching shadow of the stepmother's scheme made her heart sink. The plot to sell her for salt was not merely about profit. It was about control, humiliation, and the erasure of her very identity within her own village. Despite the looming threat, the girl continued her daily life with remarkable grace. She fetched water at dawn, her small hands steady on the wooden bucket, feeling the chill of morning mist on her skin. She tended to the animals with care, even as the stepmother sneered from the doorway, her shadowy form a constant reminder of danger. Villagers would occasionally glance her way, some offering pity, others avoiding her gaze entirely. Yet, the girl maintained her composure, each action a testament to her resilience. She kept her thoughts and fears hidden, as any display of despair might hasten her downfall or give her stepmother satisfaction. As the day approached when the stepmother intended to finalize her cruel plan, the tension in the household became palpable. The girl noticed every furtive glance, every hushed tone, every tightened jaw. Her heart ached not just for herself but for the violation of the life she had known, the small joys, the quiet moments, the few connections she had managed to maintain. And yet, even in the face of betrayal, she retained a quiet dignity, a sense that she was more than her circumstances, more than the greed and cruelty that sought to define her. The village, unaware of the storm about to unfold, continued its rhythms, children playing, women cooking, traders shouting their wares. Yet beneath this ordinary veneer, the seeds of tragedy and transformation were being sown. The girl's life, marked by humility and kindness, now stood on the precipice of an ordeal that would test the very essence of her being. It was a life about to be uprooted, a spirit on the verge of awakening to forces beyond comprehension, and a story that would one day echo through the village for generations, teaching lessons of injustice, resilience, and the unforeseen power that springs from suffering. In those quiet moments as she prepared for another day of toil, the girl could feel a storm gathering, one not of rain or wind but of fate itself. She did not yet know what lay ahead, only that the world around her had chosen cruelty over compassion. Yet within her, a spark endured, fragile but unyielding, a prelude to the transformation that awaited once the stepmother's greed reached its climax. The day began like any other, with the sun climbing lazily over the village huts, painting the earth in shades of gold and ochre. But beneath the quiet morning, a storm of human greed and betrayal was brewing, its roots entwined deeply within the heart of one woman, the girl's stepmother. She had spent weeks weaving a web of deception, carefully selecting the traders who would serve her purposes, assessing what each could offer in exchange for the girl. Salt, a commodity of immense value, would fetch coins, prestige, or perhaps even influence with the powerful men who passed through the village. Yet, the stepmother's desire went beyond mere wealth. It was a hunger for control, for domination over a life she had never loved, and for the cruel satisfaction of seeing the girl's innocence exchanged as though it were a mere object. The girl, for her part, was unaware of the full scope of the scheme, though she had felt the coldness in her stepmother's glances and the tension that filled the hut. Her intuition, born of years of cautious observation, whispered warnings that something terrible was afoot. But how could she have imagined the depth of the treachery? How could she foresee that a life as delicate and gentle as hers could be bartered in a transaction dictated by greed and malice? Each moment she spent in the household, carrying out menial chores and moving through a landscape of silent disdain, was now overshadowed by the weight of betrayal yet to be realized. As the traders arrived, their carts creaking and horses stamping impatiently, the stepmother played her part with meticulous precision. She welcomed them with forced warmth, a smile masking the cruelty lurking beneath. She spoke of the girl as though she were a commodity to be prized, soft-spoken, obedient, and well-trained in household duties. Every word she uttered was designed to increase the girl's perceived value, to ensure that the traders would offer the highest return. Meanwhile, the girl stood quietly, observing the scene with a mixture of confusion, apprehension, and growing dread. Her heart pounded as she sensed the shift in the air, the unspoken reality of what was happening. The villagers, who had long been complicit in indifference, now watched from a distance, some curious, some indifferent, and others secretly complicit in the stepmother's cruelty. They whispered among themselves, wondering how the young girl's fate would unfold. The stepmother, fully aware of their gaze, flaunted her power, savoring the sense of control and the imminent gain that would reward her malice. She moved with confidence, her gestures calculated, every motion and affirmation of her dominance over the girl's life. The girl, meanwhile, stood as a silent witness to the transaction, the innocence in her eyes clashing with the cold reality of the world surrounding her. The deal itself was a dance of greed and calculation. The traders, eager to secure such a valuable acquisition, haggled with precision, each coin and measure of salt weighed against the potential labor and utility the girl could provide. The stepmother played them masterfully, feigning reluctance, feigning consideration, until the offers met her expectations. Every gesture, every carefully chosen word, was a dagger to the girl's heart, for she realized at last that her life, her identity, and her future were being sold as easily as grains of salt. The stepmother's laughter, soft and triumphant, cut through the air like a blade, celebrating not just the profit but the power it symbolized. As the transaction concluded, the girl was handed over, exchanged for bags of salt, coins clinking in the sun, and promises of favors and status. She could barely comprehend the magnitude of what had occurred. Her stepmother's greed had not only removed her from the life she knew but had done so with a sense of joy, a perverse satisfaction that seemed to radiate from every movement and every glance. The girl's heart ached, not merely from fear but from the realization of betrayal so profound that it seemed almost impossible to bear. Every ounce of trust she had held for her family, every hope of safety within her home, had been shattered in a single cruel transaction. The traders, unaware of the moral and emotional weight of their acquisition, treated the girl as property, praising her obedience and beauty while ignoring the silent story of suffering etched into her very being. Each step away from the village, each glance at the stepmother's smug expression, deepened the girl's sorrow, yet also began to awaken a quiet, simmering resolve. The injustice, the greed, the betrayal, it all planted a seed within her, a realization that the world was capable of cruelty beyond comprehension, but that perhaps, even in such darkness, a spark of power or retribution could emerge. As she was led away, her thoughts swirled with confusion and grief. The stepmother's laughter echoed behind her, mingling with the clatter of coins and the salty scent of the goods exchanged for her life. She understood that nothing could undo the transaction, that she had been stripped of her agency and sold into a fate determined by others' greed. Yet, within that awareness, a quiet fire ignited, a sense that the injustice she endured was not the end of her story. Though her body was now in the hands of strangers, and her future uncertain, the girl's spirit remained unbroken. Even as the village receded in the distance, she felt the beginnings of something greater stir within her, a connection to the forces of the world, a resilience born of suffering, and a determination to reclaim her agency in ways the stepmother and the traders could never foresee. The salt, the wealth, the status exchanged for her life were meaningless compared to the strength awakening quietly within her, a force that would one day turn betrayal into reckoning, and malice into a lesson the world could not ignore. By the time the girl disappeared beyond the horizon, carried along by the traders and the stepmother's greed, the village remained unaware that they had merely witnessed the beginning of a story that would reverberate across time. A story in which the innocent, though sold and betrayed, would rise with power and purpose far beyond the reach of any greedy hand. The sun rose higher, spilling its golden light over the dusty paths as the young girl was led from her village. Each step felt heavier than the last, weighed down not just by the physical journey but by the crushing burden of betrayal and humiliation. Her feet, clad in worn sandals, scuffed against the rough earth, and every pebble seemed to remind her of the life she had been torn from. The stepmother's final glance, smug and triumphant, burned into her memory, a silent message that her existence had been reduced to a commodity, exchanged for salt, coins, and status. The girl's chest ached with the awareness that no one in the village would come to her aid, that her cries for help would fall on deaf ears, and that she was utterly alone, surrounded by the indifference of those who had once shared her home. The traders' carts creaked beneath the weight of goods, their horses stamping impatiently, as if even the animals sensed the tension in the air. The girl was seated carefully among their wares, a fragile presence amidst sacks of grain, burlap bags of salt, and bundles of textiles. Each movement reminded her of her vulnerability, each sway of the cart threatened to tip her into the dirt, and she clutched at the edges of the wagon not for safety, but to hold on to a sliver of control in a world that had stolen it from her. Around her, the villagers receded into the distance, their faces a mixture of curiosity, indifference, and quiet complicity. She tried to hold her head high, but shame and humiliation pressed down like an invisible weight, bending her posture and clouding her thoughts. Her mind wandered to her family, to what could have been if the stepmother had not allowed greed to overtake reason. She thought of the small hut where she had slept, the meager but comforting meals she had shared with the household, and the moments of quiet laughter that now seemed distant memories. Those memories were bittersweet, tinged with pain, because each one underscored the betrayal that had led her to this moment. Her stepmother's greed had not merely sold her body into service or labor, it had sold her dignity, her sense of belonging, and the illusion of safety she had once taken for granted. The landscape around her shifted as the cart continued, from familiar paths dotted with village huts to open fields that stretched endlessly under the burning sun. The wind swept across her face, carrying scents of earth, grass, and distant rivers, mingling with the sharp tang of salt from the trader's goods. She inhaled, trying to draw strength from the natural world, seeking comfort in the knowledge that the wind, the trees, and the rivers had always been her silent companions. Yet even nature could not ease the gnawing fear in her chest, for she did not know what awaited her at the groom's house. Would he accept her kindly, or would she be met with more cruelty, humiliation, or indifference? The uncertainty was a gnawing presence, a shadow stretching across every thought and every heartbeat. As the hours passed, the girl became increasingly aware of the eyes around her, the traders observing her movements, judging her reactions, noting the way she flinched at sudden noises or raised her hands protectively. Their attention, cold and calculating, added another layer to her anxiety. Every glance felt like a reminder that she was property, a tool in a transaction that had nothing to do with her feelings, her hopes, or her humanity. She fought to maintain composure, but the tight knot of fear in her stomach reminded her constantly of her vulnerability, the helplessness imposed by others' greed. At times, she tried to imagine the groom, picturing a man of honor or kindness who might see beyond her circumstances. Perhaps he would recognize the unfairness of her situation, the injustice that had brought her here. Yet, with each imagined scenario, doubt crept in, whispering cruelly that she was a stranger in his eyes, a possession rather than a bride, a body rather than a soul. The road stretched endlessly, and with each passing mile, the village faded further into the horizon, leaving her suspended between the past that had betrayed her and a future unknown, where fear and anticipation mingled in an uneasy alliance. The journey was not merely physical but emotional and spiritual. Each rock, each bend in the path, each sway of the wagon seemed to echo the rhythm of her heartbeat, a drum of trepidation and quiet determination. She reflected on the stepmother's betrayal, the villagers' indifference, and the trader's calculated motives, realizing that she had been thrust into a world defined by greed and cruelty. Yet within her, beneath the fear and humiliation, a spark of resolve flickered. She understood, in a subtle but undeniable way, that her spirit had not been sold, that her inner strength remained intact, even as the outer world sought to diminish her. As night approached, painting the sky in deep shades of purple and crimson, the girl felt the chill of uncertainty settle over her. She pressed herself against the wagon, clutching what little comfort remained, memories of her mother's love, quiet moments of laughter, and the sense of justice that had not yet been denied. Though the journey had been long, arduous, and frightening, she felt an inner certainty growing. She did not yet know the challenges that awaited her at the groom's home, but she sensed that the betrayal she had suffered would not define her destiny. Something deeper, a force rooted in endurance, patience, and the quiet power of innocence, had begun to awaken within her. By the time the wagon rolled to the edge of the groom's village, the young girl's eyes, though weary, held a mixture of apprehension and subtle defiance. She was still afraid, still humiliated, yet beneath the surface she carried the unbroken strength of a spirit that had survived treachery, cruelty, and betrayal. The journey had tested her body, mind, and soul, but it had also planted the seeds of resilience, determination, and the quiet, gathering power that would shape her fate in ways none of the stepmother or traders could have foreseen. The morning of the wedding arrived with a crisp, golden light, illuminating the village in hues of anticipation and excitement. Villagers bustled about, carrying baskets of food, weaving colorful decorations, and preparing the ceremonial space with meticulous care. Drums were polished, the incense burned fresh, and the air vibrated with songs celebrating union and prosperity. For everyone else, it was a day of joy, festivity, and expectation, yet for the young girl, the morning carried a heavy weight. Her heart pounded as she watched the preparations unfold, each action a reminder that she was being paraded into a new life dictated by arrangements made without her consent or choice. The happiness of others seemed to mock the turmoil she felt within. She had been provided with a new dress for the occasion, a gown that shimmered with the reflection of the sun, adorned with beads and threads painstakingly stitched by skilled hands. Yet each step she took in the silken fabric reminded her of the deceit and greed that had brought her here. The dress, though beautiful, felt like a cage, wrapping her in the trappings of ceremony while the heart of her freedom was constricted by fear. She tugged at the hem nervously, adjusting the folds, her fingers trembling as she tried to steady her breathing. Her reflection in a polished brass basin revealed a pale face, wide-eyed with trepidation, lips pressed tightly in determination, and hands that shook slightly as she clutched a small token charm she had secretly brought from home. It was the only piece of her past, her identity, and her dignity that she could hold on to in a day designed to erase her autonomy. The groom, a man of stature in the village, waited in the ceremonial courtyard, flanked by friends, family, and advisors. He was a figure cloaked in authority, expectation, and tradition. He spoke little to her, offering polite nods and smiles that did not reach his eyes, leaving her unsure of his intentions or feelings. To him, she was not yet a partner but a component in a social arrangement that reinforced alliances, status, and wealth. The villagers, aware of the transactional nature of the union, whispered among themselves, exchanging anticipatory glances, nods, and approving murmurs. They had invested time, effort, and pride into the ceremony, expecting the day to be flawless and the young bride to conform perfectly to the customs. As the music swelled, she felt the weight of all eyes upon her. Children peeked from behind woven walls, older women whispered comments on her appearance, and even the men in attendance evaluated her silently. Every glance felt like a judgment, every murmur a critique of her worth and place in this new household. Her chest tightened with anxiety, a knot of apprehension and unease forming within her, but she reminded herself that despite the fear, she was still present, still breathing, and still capable of observing and responding to the world around her. Her mother's charm pressed against her palm, grounding her in a sense of continuity and quiet courage. The ceremonial space was fragrant with flowers and spices, arranged with care to honor tradition and expectation. The air was thick with the aroma of roasted grains, sweetened palm wine, and the soft musk of incense burning in intricate clay vessels. She inhaled deeply, trying to center herself, letting the scents mingle with memories of her past life, comforting and unsettling all at once. Every movement of the villagers seemed choreographed, precise, and deliberate, and she found herself caught in a rhythm she had not learned, a dance of expectation and submission she had no choice but to follow. As the officiant began the ritual, reciting blessings, prayers, and instructions in a tone of solemn authority, the young girl's nerves heightened. The rituals were intricate. Offerings were made, the bride and groom exchanged symbolic items and vows, some spoken aloud, others silently observed, were woven into the ceremony. She tried to memorize each action, each word, yet her thoughts continually returned to the uncertainty that lay ahead. The groom's expression remained neutral, his eyes distant, leaving her unsure if he recognized her presence beyond the obligations of custom. The community's gaze, unwavering and expectant, pressed upon her like a tangible force, reminding her that she was under scrutiny and that any misstep, hesitation, or sign of fear could provoke disapproval or worse. Despite the anxiety, the young girl observed carefully, noticing the smallest details, the subtle gestures of the elders, the way the musicians adjusted their rhythm, the flickering light reflecting on polished beads, and the soft rustle of silk against the ceremonial floor. Each observation sharpened her awareness, revealing the delicate interplay of tradition, expectation, and authority. She understood that her actions, though constrained, could influence the perception of her character, even within a system designed to strip her of voice and choice. Outside, the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the courtyard. The villagers adjusted decorations, prepared offerings, and murmured anticipatory chants. Each sound, each movement heightened her nervousness but also reminded her of the power inherent in observation and patience. She was at the center of the ceremony, yet she was not powerless. She could see, she could think, she could feel. The anticipation of the groom, the weight of community expectation, and the steps of tradition pressed heavily upon her, but they also marked the moment as pivotal, a threshold between past suffering and the unknown future. As the ceremony drew closer to its climax, the girl took a deep breath, steadying her hands, calming her thoughts, and bracing herself for the vows and rituals that would bind her in ways she could not yet comprehend. Her nervousness remained, but so did a quiet resolve, a determination to survive, to endure, and to observe everything that transpired. The village watched, the groom waited, and she stood poised between fear and resilience, knowing that the events of this day would echo far beyond the ceremonial courtyard and into the life she was about to enter. The wedding preparations, elaborate and exhausting, were more than just a display of tradition. They were a crucible, testing the girl's composure, patience, and strength. As she adjusted her attire one final time, feeling the warmth of the sun and the weight of gazes upon her, she realized that the day was both an ending and a beginning. Her past, filled with betrayal and hardship, had led her to this precise moment, but what she carried within, her dignity, resilience, and quiet strength, would shape her path far more than the expectations of the groom or the community. The preparations, in all their splendor and ritual, were complete, leaving her standing at the threshold of an uncertain yet fateful night. The ceremony had reached its most critical moment, the point where tradition and expectation converged in ritual precision. The young girl, still dressed in the shimmering gown provided by her stepmother, felt the weight of every eye in the village upon her. Her heart raced with anticipation, dread, and a flicker of hope that she might survive this night unscathed. Before her lay a small, intricately carved dish, gleaming under the firelight and filled with coarse, white grains, salt, the element that symbolized both sustenance and covenant. To the untrained eye, it was a simple offering, a customary gesture intended to honor her role in the union and the agreement she had been sold into. To her, the salt was heavy with meaning, a reminder of her stepmother's greed, the deception that had brought her here, and the fragile thread of fate upon which her life now hung. The groom, seated across from her, watched intently as the dish was placed before them. He extended a hand casually to take some, a smile barely brushing his lips. The villagers leaned in, curious, murmuring softly about the significance of the ritual. Salt was no ordinary substance in their culture. It symbolized purity, preservation, and the binding of promises. By serving it, the bride acknowledged her new household and her role within it. By partaking in it, the groom accepted the responsibility and commitment to honor her. Yet, in this instance, the ritual was tainted by betrayal. The girl's stepmother, who had orchestrated the trade with greed in her eyes, had ensured that the salt bore more than its ordinary properties. What seemed harmless was subtly cursed, a secret unknown to all but her mother's spirit, who had long whispered warnings she could barely understand. The young girl's hands trembled as she reached for the dish. Her fingers hovered above the coarse grains, feeling their texture, rough, almost cold, yet oddly alive under her touch. A faint, almost imperceptible hum vibrated through the salt as though it recognized her presence, responding to the mix of fear, sorrow, and quiet defiance that radiated from her. She glanced around the courtyard, taking in the groom's expectant expression, the whispered commentary of the villagers, and the anxious faces of those who had arranged her fate. Every detail seemed amplified, each glance a subtle accusation, each movement a reminder of the manipulation and control imposed upon her. Yet within this charged atmosphere, a strange awareness began to stir within her, an instinctive knowledge that the salt, simple as it seemed, was more than a seasoning or ceremonial offering. As the moment drew nearer, the groom took a pinch of the salt, holding it carefully between his fingers, and offered it to her as well, following the prescribed ritual. She moved slowly, deliberately, aware that each gesture was being scrutinized, recorded, and interpreted by everyone present. The grains fell from her fingers like tiny stars, scattering across the dish, and as they settled, a faint shimmer rose from the surface. Her heart skipped, sensing that something unusual was afoot. The villagers, engrossed in their assumptions, did not notice the subtle flicker of energy. Only she felt it, the almost imperceptible warmth and movement that pulsed in rhythm with her own heartbeat. The salt was reacting to her presence, and though she did not yet understand the magnitude, an unspoken power hummed beneath its surface. The groom, unaware of the impending twist, tasted a small portion and nodded in satisfaction. "It is perfect," he murmured, savoring the expected flavor, praising the ritual and the young girl's adherence to tradition. Around him, the villagers clapped, exchanged nods and murmured blessings, thinking the ceremony was unfolding without disruption. Yet the girl's gaze remained fixed on the dish, noting subtle changes, a glimmer in the grains, a faint undulation, almost as if the salt were alive, poised for a response. Her pulse quickened as intuition whispered a warning. This salt, which symbolized her servitude and compliance, carried within it an unexpected potential for reversal. The very act intended to bind her to her fate might instead become the instrument of justice. Carefully, she moved her hand above the dish again, feeling the faint heat that had begun to rise from the salt. The energy resonated with her sorrow, anger, and quiet resilience, intertwining her spirit with the grains in ways she could barely comprehend. Around her, the villagers continued to celebrate the ritual, oblivious to the subtle signs of change. Each pinch of salt she offered or allowed to be tasted seemed to pulse with latent energy, attuned to the injustice of her sale, the cruelty she had endured, and the indignity imposed upon her. Though no one spoke and no one noticed, the dish had become a conduit, a bridge between the quiet power within her and the material world around her. As the ceremonial portion drew to a close, she stepped back slightly, maintaining composure despite the tremor in her limbs and the tension coiling in her chest. The groom had taken the salt as expected, the villagers had performed their rituals, and the night appeared to proceed according to tradition. But the girl knew differently. The salt, now infused with the energy of her suffering, awareness, and quiet defiance, held the potential to upend everything. The grain that had been a symbol of her subjugation was now a harbinger, waiting for the moment when her presence, her recognition, and her inner strength would bring the true power within it to life. By the time the villagers had concluded the ceremonial blessing, the young girl's pulse had steadied, her gaze sharp and observant. She understood the subtle balance she now controlled, the dish of salt no longer merely ceremonial but symbolic of a power that could not be ignored. What had been offered to her and to the groom had shifted. The evening, the night, and the impending wedding were now charged with tension, anticipation, and a supernatural potential that no mortal could anticipate. The grains shimmered faintly in the torchlight, and she felt, with unshakable certainty, that the moment of reckoning was approaching, heralded by the humble yet potent salt that had been placed in her hands. The night settled over the village like a heavy, watchful blanket, yet beneath its quiet, subtle disturbances began to ripple. The air itself seemed charged, holding a tension that the villagers could not name but felt instinctively. Birds refused to roost on the usual branches, fluttering restlessly from tree to tree, their calls sharp and piercing, carrying a note of alarm that echoed unnervingly through the streets. Dogs whined and paced, ears pricked toward invisible movements, noses twitching as though they could smell danger, though no threat was visibly present. Cats hissed at empty corners and leapt away from shadows that no one else could perceive, their fur standing on end as though warning of something unseen. The animals, more sensitive to the world's subtleties than humans, sensed the unnatural energy that had begun to infuse the village. In the households where the wedding preparations had taken place, simple objects seemed to resist order. Cups tipped over without contact, grains of flour scattered across the floors as though shaken by invisible hands, and lanterns flickered erratically despite no draft or wind to disturb them. The village dogs barked continuously at the empty road, their cries echoing down the alleyways and into the fields beyond. Horses shied in their stalls, stamping hooves and backing into corners, sweat forming along their flanks in nervous beads. Even the firelight, which once danced predictably, now shifted in strange patterns, shadows elongating unnaturally, stretching across walls in ways that made the villagers' hearts tighten with fear. The salt, now placed at the center of the ceremonial table, seemed to carry its own quiet pulse. Though it appeared inert, coarse, and ordinary to anyone else, a subtle shimmer could be detected by the girl and a few attuned villagers. When the torches flickered across the grains, they seemed to glimmer briefly, catching the eye with a fleeting light that vanished as quickly as it came. The air around it grew warmer, the surface almost trembling as though aware of her gaze. A faint hum, almost imperceptible, echoed from it at intervals, like the echo of a deep river current or the whisper of wind through cavernous trees. Every movement of her hand, every glance she gave, seemed to strengthen the connection between her and the grains, as if the salt itself were waiting, breathing, and growing in awareness. Some villagers began noticing minor signs before fully understanding them, though they dismissed their intuition as imagination. The newly baked bread cooled unnaturally fast, its crust hardening before anyone could taste it. The wine offered to guests appeared to sour despite careful preservation, and even simple water in clay jars rippled strangely when no wind disturbed the air. Lamps flickered as though reacting to a hidden presence, and the shadows cast by the flames twisted and danced with intent, stretching toward corners and walls as if observing the room. Children shivered despite warm air, their eyes following invisible shapes that moved at the edges of their vision. All the while, the girl watched quietly, sensing the unseen forces stirring, understanding that these were the earliest signals of the power she and the cursed salt were beginning to wield. The village elders, steeped in superstition, began muttering among themselves. They noted the omens: an owl perched unusually close, hooting in slow, deliberate rhythm, a sudden gust of wind that moved through narrow streets, carrying the scent of burning leaves though no fire had been lit, a shadow across the central courtyard that did not align with any person or object present. Fear and unease crept into their voices, their eyes darting nervously toward the young girl. Whispers of bad luck, and omens of the gods, passed between them. Though they tried to rationalize the occurrences, a gnawing sense of dread settled into the community like a slow poison. Outside the main courtyard, animals continued to behave erratically. Goats refused to eat from their troughs, bleating with a sense of panic. Chickens clucked frantically, running in circles, wings flapping against their pens, and one hen even tore at her feathers, shrieking as though driven mad by unseen forces. The village dogs, now barking in unison, created a cacophony that carried across the streets, a warning to all who could hear. Even the river near the village seemed restless, ripples forming along the banks without wind, and a faint melodic hum rising from its depths, barely audible yet deeply unsettling. The girl felt it all. Every sign, every movement, every subtle disturbance resonated with her awareness of the salt's latent power. She could feel the threads of energy extending from the grains to the world around them, touching animals, humans, plants, and even the air itself. A sense of anticipation built inside her. Not fear, but the sharp, clear recognition that the forces of nature were aligning in response to injustice. Every whisper in the wind, every flicker in the shadows, every restless animal was a herald, announcing that what had been set in motion could not be ignored or contained. By the time the villagers realized the severity of the omens, unease had taken root deeply in every heart. No one could sleep, no one could focus, and even those who tried to distract themselves with conversation found their minds drawn to the growing tension. Shadows seemed to linger in doorways longer than they should, lights appeared dimmer, and the simple act of touching the salt made the fingers tingle. The signs were everywhere, subtle yet undeniable, a warning that the unseen was aware and that their neglect, cruelty and greed would not go unpunished. The air was thick with anticipation, and even those who had ignored the girl's presence until now could feel the undeniable weight of the supernatural, signaling that the moment of reckoning was approaching, carried on the wings of whispering omens. As the sun dipped low beyond the horizon, painting the village sky in hues of blood red and deep purple, a tense hush settled over the households preparing for the wedding night. The air carried a weight of anticipation, thick and almost suffocating, as if the very atmosphere itself knew that something was amiss. The young girl, her heart pounding against her chest like the rhythmic drumming of distant thunder, moved through the decorated corridors of her new home, each step careful, measured, and filled with trepidation. Her hands trembled slightly, brushing over the intricate fabrics and ceremonial ornaments that adorned the hallways, the colorful banners fluttering slightly in the evening breeze. Though the decorations gleamed in the dimming light, reflecting a sense of celebration, her eyes could see only the shadows that seemed to grow longer with each passing minute. Her mind raced as she recalled the events that had led her here, the cruel betrayal of her stepmother, the exchange for wealth and salt, the journey to this unknown life. The anticipation she had once felt when preparing for a new chapter had long vanished, replaced by a gnawing fear that clung to her like a second skin. Every sound, from the soft crackle of the torches to the distant calls of the nocturnal animals, sent shivers crawling up her spine. She felt the weight of the salt given to her, a simple substance that carried within it the promise of unimaginable power, waiting to reveal its true nature when the moment was right. The grains pressed against her fingers as she held them, and she felt an almost imperceptible pulse, like the quiet heartbeat of the earth itself, steady and relentless. Meanwhile, the groom, unaware of the omens and the latent force within the salt, prepared himself with a sense of pride and entitlement. He donned his ceremonial garments, rich in color and embroidery, each thread reflecting the village's admiration for his family's supposed status. To him, this night was an assertion of dominance, a display of ownership, and he approached it with arrogance rather than reverence. He did not perceive the tension in the air, nor the subtle disturbances that had already begun. Shadows that lingered too long, whispers of wind that seemed to murmur warnings, and animals behaving with inexplicable unease. He adjusted his robe and smirked, confident in the certainty that the girl would be nothing more than a passive participant in the evening's rituals. As the sky deepened into a velvety black, the first stars appearing like pinpricks of light, the young girl sought solace in quiet corners, clutching her treasures and the grains of salt close to her. She had learned, during the journey and the wedding preparations, that the world often acted with cruelty and blind ambition, dismissing innocence as weakness. And yet, beneath her fear, a quiet determination began to stir, fueled by the knowledge that the salt carried power that could not be contained by simple human malice. She could feel it, subtle and insistent, as the winds brushed against her skin and the flames of the torches flickered in response to her presence. The corridors and halls were filled with the low murmur of the villagers and wedding guests, their laughter and chatter masking the undercurrent of anxiety that had begun to pervade the village. Servants moved swiftly, setting the ceremonial table and arranging the food, unaware of the supernatural tension that had begun to grow. Every movement of their hands seemed slightly delayed, as if the room itself resisted their actions. The torches flickered more violently with each passing minute, and the shadows cast against the walls seemed to take on shapes that mirrored the villagers' hidden guilt, whispering silently that their actions had set in motion a chain of events beyond their understanding. In the distance, the first strains of evening songs began to float through the air, meant to soothe and celebrate. But the girl heard them differently, each note vibrating with an eerie resonance, amplifying the tension she felt in her chest. She knew that the night was not merely a passage of time, but the threshold for what was to come. The air felt thick, charged with expectation, and the village seemed suspended between fear and celebration, ignorance and revelation. Each tick of the clock, each faint sound from the village beyond, seemed to echo within her mind, reminding her that the night would soon decide the fate of everyone present. She approached the ceremonial chamber cautiously, her steps guided by instinct and a growing awareness of the supernatural currents around her. The grains of salt in her hands shimmered faintly, almost imperceptibly, as if responding to her mounting determination. She could feel the energy building, subtle at first, then stronger, entwining with her heartbeat and the very atmosphere of the room. The air itself seemed to respond, humming with a low vibration that resonated through the wooden floors, the walls, and even the torches that cast a golden glow across the chamber. The villagers, caught up in the anticipation and the pomp of the ceremony, were blind to these signs. They laughed, they whispered, they adjusted their garments, oblivious to the subtle omens gathering strength in their midst. Yet even in their ignorance, the tension was palpable, an unacknowledged force pressing against the edges of their senses, warning them that the night would not unfold as they imagined. The groom, in his arrogance, remained the least aware, certain of his control over the proceedings, blind to the supernatural energy converging in the very grains of salt that had been placed in her hands. As darkness fully enveloped the village, the girl stood at the threshold of the ceremonial room, trembling yet resolute. She could feel the power within her coiling like a spring, ready to release, a force that had been patiently gathering throughout her hardships, her journey, and the betrayal that had brought her here. The wind whispered through the windows and doors, the shadows stretched their long fingers across the floors, and the animals outside continued to sense what the villagers could not, the imminence of reckoning. The night was poised, the tension complete, and the moment of truth was almost upon them. She inhaled deeply, feeling the pulse of the salt, the heartbeat of the earth, and the rising awareness of her own emerging power. The night approached, and with it, the revelation that would change everything. Fear gripped her, but alongside it surged a quiet, unyielding strength. The girl knew that the wedding night was no longer merely a passage into marriage. It was the threshold where destiny, vengeance, and supernatural justice would intertwine, and nothing in the village would remain untouched by what was to come. As the village slept beneath a moonless sky, a quiet tension lingered in the air, almost imperceptible to the untrained eye, yet unmistakable to those attuned to subtle signs of change. Within the bridal chamber, the young girl sat quietly, her fingers tracing the smooth grains of salt she had been given earlier in the day. What had seemed an ordinary gift now hummed with a strange electric energy, each crystal pulsing faintly as if alive. The air in the room thickened, carrying the scent of earth and minerals, and a faint glow shimmered off the grains, bathing the girl's hands in a pale, eerie light. She sensed the moment approaching, the culmination of her suffering, her betrayal, and the hidden justice that had been silently gathering since the day her stepmother sold her. The salt, simple in appearance yet laden with supernatural intent, began to vibrate in her palms. Each grain responded to her awareness, a reflection of the injustice that had been inflicted upon her. She felt it coiling with quiet precision, like the steady tightening of a rope, preparing to strike at those who had dared treat her as property, as an object to be bartered for status or wealth. The girl's heart pounded with anticipation, a mixture of fear and righteous anger. Her eyes, wide and shimmering with emotion, scanned the room, sensing the presence of unseen forces ready to obey her will. The salt was no longer mere seasoning, it was an instrument of vengeance, a silent executioner waiting for its cue. Outside the chamber, the village remained oblivious, caught in the routine of the ceremonial night. The groom, confident in his authority, adjusted his garments, unaware that the very substance he would consume in his union with the girl had transformed into a weapon against greed and cruelty. The celebratory laughter, the clinking of cups, the hum of the ceremonial drums, all resonated faintly against the impending storm of retribution. The villagers believed themselves safe, yet the air had begun to hum with a subtle, unnatural vibration, as if the world itself held its breath, waiting for the first ripple of the girl's justice to unfold. Back inside, the girl closed her eyes and whispered the softest of prayers, her voice nearly drowned by the building tension. She called upon every memory of humiliation, every act of cruelty, and every pang of betrayal. Her sorrow, combined with the latent magic within the salt, began to transform it in earnest. The grains grew sharper, brighter, and heavier, their crystalline structure twisting and changing, coalescing into a fine, almost invisible dust that carried within it the power to exact immediate, precise vengeance. Her anger, restrained for so long, became the catalyst, feeding the salt's transformation with a precision and intelligence beyond mortal understanding. The first sign of the change was subtle, a slight shimmer over the feast, a momentary pause in the candle flames as if the very air had become conscious. The salt, once benign, now radiated a quiet heat, a presence that was felt rather than seen. Those who had previously laughed, who had plotted, who had shown greed in its many forms, began to feel an inexplicable unease. Their hands trembled as they reached for cups and plates. Their eyes darted nervously across the tables, sensing a subtle danger they could not comprehend. Whispers of old superstitions, of curses long forgotten, drifted into their minds like the distant tolling of a bell, warning them that justice was not only coming, it had arrived. When the first grain of transformed salt touched the food, the change became undeniable. Colors shifted, textures warped, and an invisible poison infused the dishes, carrying with it the concentrated intent of the girl's vengeance. The first morsels, when consumed, left an icy fire in the mouths of the greedy, a sensation of retribution that crept into their veins with each swallow. Panic spread quietly at first, a ripple of fear as individuals began to feel the unnatural effects. Faces twisted in confusion, eyes widened in terror, and fingers shook uncontrollably. The food that had promised celebration now delivered judgment, and the villagers were helpless against its precise targeting of guilt and greed. The girl, witnessing this from her place, remained calm yet resolute. She did not move, she did not need to. The salt acted with the precision of her silent command, each crystal finding its mark on those who deserved it. No harm came to the innocent, to those who had treated her with respect or kindness, yet the greedy and cruel trembled under the invisible force. Their screams, their attempts to flee, and their desperate cries for mercy fell into an empty chamber. The magic of the salt did not require overt violence. It was intelligence incarnate, meting out punishment with an eerie balance that left no doubt of justice. By the time the night deepened and shadows wrapped the village in a dark embrace, the transformation had fully completed. The feast lay in ruins, not through fire or physical destruction, but through the supernatural precision of the girl's vengeance. The salt, now an extension of her will, had silenced arrogance, punished betrayal, and turned greed into immediate consequence. The villagers, now trembling, whispered in terror as they realized that the simplest of elements, the grains of salt, had become an instrument of inescapable justice. As dawn approached, the girl's hands fell softly into her lap. The salt's energy receded, leaving only the memory of its power and the stark lesson imprinted in the hearts of the guilty. The night had proven that cruelty and betrayal carried weight beyond mortal understanding, and that the innocent, when pushed beyond endurance, could command forces that punished with terrifying precision. The girl, silent yet triumphant, remained a quiet observer, knowing that the transformation of the salt had restored balance in a way no mortal hand could achieve. The night after the girl's salt took its full form of vengeance, the air in the village was thick with an almost tangible tension, heavy with dread and the faint scent of iron and earth. The step-relatives who had orchestrated her betrayal awoke with a growing sense of unease, a prickling in the back of their necks as though unseen eyes were watching their every move. Sleep, which had once come easily, now eluded them entirely. Every rustle in the wind, every whisper of leaves outside their windows, seemed amplified into a malicious sound that rattled their nerves. They shivered under blankets that felt suddenly thin and fragile, as if some invisible hand pressed down on them, warning them of the punishment yet to come. By the dim light of dawn, tremors of anxiety ran through the household. The step-relatives gathered around the table, attempting to maintain a facade of normalcy. Yet the remnants of the cursed feast had already begun to take effect. The air inside the rooms felt thick, heavy, charged with an unseen force that seemed to pulse in time with their racing hearts. Their tongues stumbled over words that had previously carried the sharpness of confidence. Their hands, once steady and commanding, now shook as if refusing to perform the simplest motions. The very food before them, previously prepared to celebrate their ill-gotten gain, now twisted in strange ways, refusing to be consumed. A taste turned bitter, another morsel burned their lips, and the grainy texture of salt became an agonizing reminder of the girl's silent, watchful power. Panic began to spread among them like wildfire. One of the step-relatives, a woman who had taken the lead in arranging the girl's sale for salt, clutched her stomach and fell to the floor, convulsing as if invisible hands had gripped her from within. Her cries echoed across the house, but no comfort came and no neighbor dared intervene. The others tried to help, yet each movement seemed to provoke the very force punishing them. Doors slammed shut on their own, shadows lengthened unnaturally, and the flickering candlelight cast grotesque forms across the walls, transforming familiar surroundings into a nightmarish landscape. Fear, once dormant, now consumed every thought and intention. As the hours passed, the punishment became more personalized, as if the girl's spirit, infused into the very salt she had carried, understood the sins of each relative individually. One step-relative, the man responsible for enforcing her exile, found himself trapped in his own chair as the weight of his guilt materialized, pressing him down until he could barely breathe. Each breath he drew came with sharp, searing pain, like shards of the very salt piercing his lungs and throat. He screamed, calling for his siblings, for his mother, anyone to relieve him, but the sound fell into an eerie silence, swallowed by the unseen judgment that had awakened that night. Another, a younger relative who had only followed orders out of fear, faced a subtler but no less devastating punishment. Each movement he attempted was countered by invisible resistance. The floor seemed to grip his feet, the walls leaned closer, the shadows coiled around him. Every attempt to flee was thwarted, leaving him trembling and weak, forced to confront the consequences of even minor complicity. His guilt, previously dismissed as trivial, now weighed heavier than any chains could, and the realization that the girl's vengeance was precise, intelligent, and unwavering left him quaking with despair. Meanwhile, the older matriarch, the stepmother herself, could feel the culmination of all her schemes converging into a single, unbearable force. Her dreams had become a theater of horror. She saw the girl's face in every reflective surface, heard her whispers in the rustling of every curtain, and felt invisible flames licking her skin without burning her flesh yet leaving her terrified. Each deceit, every cruel word and gesture, replayed itself endlessly in her mind, growing more vivid and more painful with each cycle. Her power over the household, once absolute, crumbled completely. She realized with mounting horror that no bribe, apology, or act of repentance could undo the judgment that had been long in preparation. By the time the moon reached its zenith, the punishments had escalated further. Walls cracked under the pressure of unseen forces, and the ground beneath them seemed to pulse with the rhythm of the girl's righteous wrath. The step-relatives, now fully aware that they were powerless, could do nothing but scream, writhe, and beg silently for mercy that would not come. Their wealth, their status, their bonds to one another, none of it could shield them from the consequences of their cruelty. The girl's spirit, entwined with the salt and the magical essence of her suffering, ensured that justice was exacted evenly but unmistakably, leaving no possibility for escape or denial. As dawn approached, the aftermath was clear. The step-relatives were left physically unharmed in some cases but mentally and spiritually scarred beyond repair. Panic, trembling, and a sense of inescapable doom dominated their every thought. They moved through the village in a haze of terror, aware that the girl's vengeance, though complete for the night, lingered like a shadow over every corner of their lives. They whispered her name in hushed tones, afraid that even acknowledging her presence too loudly would provoke further punishment. By sunrise, the lesson had been seared into their minds. Cruelty and greed exact a price far beyond mere human retribution. The step-relatives, forever marked by fear, understood that the girl, once silenced and powerless, now held a force they could neither comprehend nor escape. Her punishment was precise, intelligent, and relentless, a testament to the reckoning that follows betrayal and injustice. The village, witnessing the aftermath, would never forget the night when vengeance rose from innocence wronged, and the step-relatives became living reminders that betrayal carries consequences too heavy to bear.